So what are the Russians and Ukrainian propaganda up to again? Is the key component of the Russian intercontinental ballistic missile Sarmat Ukrainian expertise? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have some information that the Russians' currently developed Sarmat missile is exploding. And for example, the YouTube channel Voyenska Realita is basically spreading information that this new intercontinental missile, which is designated as Satan II in NATO code and Sarmat in Russian code, is supposed to be the successor to Satan I, also known as Voyevoda. So it's said that it's exploding, it's not working for them, and the development is actually being delayed. And it's true that this isn't really working for them, and that the development is being delayed and getting more expensive. It's also true that the loss of Ukrainian expertise is a factor, but it's a huge oversimplification to say that just because the Russians are struggling to develop a new intercontinental missile that's supposed to be revolutionary, and it's still not really operational, not working, and there are no convincing successful tests, it's a huge leap to say that because of the loss of Ukrainian expertise, the Russians have lost the ability to use their nuclear weapons. These are the kinds of claims being spread on social media, mostly by people who are pushing the hardest Ukrainian propaganda. Now, we should take a look at what the situation really looks like, what the reality is with Ukrainian expertise, and what the actual state of Russian nuclear forces is, as far as we can estimate, whether it works or doesn't work. And of course, we'll also talk a bit about how these missiles could theoretically be used. And finally, I'd like to talk about why something like this actually started spreading from the Ukrainian side. So let's start with the Ukrainian expertise, because indeed when the development of Sarmat or Satan II began, Ukrainian expertise was helping the Russians maintain the Satan I missiles as well as other missiles, because the Ukrainian rocket industry and Ukrainian rocket science were at a high level at that time. And as for the Soviet Union, for example, most of the experts in the rocket program actually had their education or origins in Ukraine. So in this regard, the loss of that Ukrainian expertise really hurt. And besides that, the very fact that the Russians had to start putting their resources into waging war in Ukraine and couldn't allocate as much to the development of these new rockets, that caused delays and even led to this tragic accident which took out half the forest and even caused some additional damage. Nevertheless, the development of this rocket began. It started in 2011. The first tests were around 2022. Some of them were successful, while others were unsuccessful. The most recent test that took place was on May 12, 2026, so quite recently. And according to the Russian side, this test of the Sarmat missile was already successful. So even though the Russians have lost that Ukrainian expertise, and even though it took them longer, it doesn't mean they've lost the ability to develop it. That only means they had to replace that expertise with someone else. They had to train some people, and some people who weren't experienced had to gain experience. Maybe that's also why some of those accidents happened. Accidents that wouldn't have happened if the old Ukrainian experts had been working on it. Or maybe those resources could have gone fully into the missiles instead of being diverted more to the Ukrainian front. But now they already have those missiles. So that's something we need to realize and something we need to admit. So, and now what exactly is it? What exactly is the Sarmat missile? The Sarmat missile is a missile that is designated as Satan in NATO code. It is a missile that is supposed to weigh 208 tons, be 35 meters long, and have a diameter of 3 meters. It is a missile, so it is a ballistic missile. And it runs on liquid fuel. As for liquid fuel, it basically has the advantage for us and the disadvantage for the Russians that it's fuel that usually isn't kept in the missile. Most of the time it's not there and it has to be filled in somehow. And the moment this process starts happening, you can already notice that something is going on, and you can already see that the Russians are trying to do something. So you have some time to react. Otherwise, regarding the missile's capability, it should work in such a way that it can reach up to 35,000 kilometers, so it actually goes outside the atmosphere. Outside the atmosphere, it should be able to cover both the distance and the speed required. And then it should split into several warheads, and those warheads should hit predetermined targets. The fact that the missile should contain many warheads, including decoys, is supposed to ensure that strategic nuclear weapons will be delivered. That's important. These intercontinental missiles are primarily carriers of strategic nuclear weapons, so the fact that they might not work perfectly isn't that crucial. What's more important is that you can somehow convince your opponent that there's a certain chance they will work, so that the opponent doesn't want to risk it. So in this respect, the fact that the Russians carried out a successful test, which isn't shown in this video, but they carried out a successful test and announced it, that has power in itself, because right now we may not know for sure, but we can assume that the Russians have something like this, that they are capable of something like this. Therefore, a strategic nuclear warhead can already be delivered by that intercontinental missile to those places, and it already plays its role, it already has its weight. Otherwise, regarding this missile, its specific feature is that it has a really long range and could be sent over the South Pole, not the North Pole, where the Americans, if it were to be used against the Americans, have a fairly strong defense that could neutralize this missile, even though, of course, Satan too is supposed to have the ability to bypass air defenses. Yeah, but even if it didn't have that ability, the fact that it would be used through the South Pole gives the intercontinental missile and its warheads a much greater chance to bypass those air defenses and hit their target. So now let's take a look at what the main misconception is, the main mistake that people make. So, first of all, it's important to say that even though the Russians had a big problem developing Satan II, they still had Satan I or Voyvoda, which is a Soviet intercontinental missile that clearly had a shorter range, was slower, and wasn't as sophisticated, but it was still a very fast intercontinental missile capable of delivering a strategic nuclear bomb to its target. Therefore, even if the Russians didn't have the Wunderwaffe, the functional Wunderwaffe Satan II, they still have perfectly functional Cold War-era delivery systems and warheads, perfectly functional nuclear warheads that you can mount on Satan I. So this is a huge mistake made by everyone who says that the Russians might not have functional nuclear weapons because they don't invest money into it, because of Russian carelessness, because Ukrainian expertise is gone, or because their new generation of missiles exploded here. No, they do. They have them because they have the old types. And even if those Satans didn't work for them, even if these intercontinental missiles in the silos didn't work, there are other forces like the mobile Yars and Topol units which aren't as powerful, can't carry such large warheads and can't reach as far, but they have the advantage of being mobile, and you never really know where they are if the Russians don't want you to know, especially if, for example, they didn't respect the New START agreement and similar agreements. And similar agreements, which, by the way, are no longer in force now, or rather have expired. So in this respect, they have these Yars and Topol missiles. You know? So these are other strategic warheads that they possess. Besides that, of course, the Russians also have other delivery systems which cannot carry strategic nuclear weapons, but they can carry tactical nuclear weapons. And a tactical nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon with a yield that could, for example, wipe Olomouc off the map. These are much weaker, but still extremely powerful weapon systems, which can simply be delivered to their target by a nuclear-capable bomber, or a submarine can send them there, or the often mentioned Oreshnik can send them there. All of these are still capabilities of the Russian Federation to deliver nuclear weapons, which are excellent, truly proven, and clearly show that the Russians are capable of this, even if they lack Ukrainian expertise and even if their Sarmats are exploding here. Yeah? That's how it is. I would also add that at this moment, the Americans have also launched a nuclear weapon, specifically a Minuteman III missile which was used. They claim that it wasn't a response to the fact that the Russians managed to launch the Sarmat Satan II missile. It's hard to say what it was actually a response to. However, the point is that they have this capability. These missiles are smaller, they have a smaller payload, and the Americans more or less rely on being able to hit their target. Exactly, while the Russians generally have larger and more powerful strategic warheads, so they don't actually need to hit the target perfectly, because their nuclear bomb will wipe out the city even if it lands nearby, right? Because it has such a huge explosion, such a massive blast radius that it just wipes out the city. And then we have, for example, the Chinese Dongfeng missiles. The Chinese Dongfeng missiles are also basically delivery systems for mostly tactical nuclear weapons, because the Chinese produce nuclear weapons with lower destructive power. As I said, they are also mobile, and the Sarmat has a much greater range and things like that. It has better technology when it comes to evading anti-missile systems, at least according to what the Russians say, right? They are supposedly better than the Chinese Dongfeng missiles, but the Chinese have these as well. And apparently Chinese expertise actually helped the Russians finish, complete, and fine-tune that troublesome Sarmat missile. So in this regard, I think it's now absolutely clear and absolutely crucial to understand that if there's anything in the Russian army that's in good shape, it's the nuclear forces, the nuclear weapons, and the nuclear delivery systems, because Russia's ability to defend itself depends on this, and that's where the money really goes. We have a lot of testimonies, we have a lot of reports that tanks are being stripped, planes are being looted, ships are being looted, everything is being looted, but there's one thing that isn't being looted and one thing that has enough money. Strategic nuclear forces. So really don't underestimate the Russians. They really can be sloppy in everything possible. In mass production, in banking, in offices, everywhere they can be sloppy. And that sloppiness is everywhere. That's why Russia is where it is. They should be much further ahead. If they didn't have the Russian mentality but had a proper mentality, they would be much further and much better off. But where it works is in the small batch production of nuclear weapons, where Russian science is involved, and Russian science has always been at a high level. It's always been high quality. Politicians and poor mass production often ruined it, but small batch production remained excellent. So, as I said, don't underestimate the enemy. Don't spread nonsense about Russia not having functional nuclear weapons. They have perfectly functional ones. Don't fall for every single piece of Ukrainian propaganda that gets released, because Ukrainians often put out propaganda that's similar to the Russian kind in that there's some truth to it, but it's taken out of context and they leave out the important parts. The purpose is basically to create uncertainty, to give their own people a dose of copium, and to cause doubts among the Russian population or pro-Russian people who might come across it. Plain and simple, Ukrainians do propaganda, so always thoroughly verify information coming from Ukrainian propaganda sites, politicians, and soldiers, just as you would if it came from the Russians. Just like you verify what Putin says, what Peskov says, what Gerasimov says, you should also verify what Zelensky says, what Zaluzhny says, what Surovikin, Syrsky, and so on say. Surovikin is Russian, Syrsky, and so on, right? So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's all for now. Write in the comments what you think about it. Whether this Ukrainian, it's hard to call it disinformation, but rather a Ukrainian attempt to manipulate information, made its way to you if you've heard about it, and what you think about it. Support the content through the QR code if you like it, and we'll see each other again next time. Come to the streams where these videos are made, and of course we're moving forward.